First job, well, I couldn't get a job. This was Depression time. And there was a fellow by the name of Joe Maddie, Professor Joseph Maddie, who was a professor of music at the University of Michigan. And I had announced his s- series of radio music broadcasts, broadcast to schools around America from the University of Michigan campus during my senior year there. And he also ran the National Music Camp up in Interlochen, Michigan. And because I couldn't get a job, I auditioned for a job in Muskegon, Michigan. I didn't want to go back east, didn't want to go home. I wanted to stay out in the Middle West and wanted to be a radio announcer. That's after I had spent a couple of years uh, immersing myself in the broadcasting at the University of Michigan. I took a lot of courses, the usual college courses, but I spent a lot of time at the radio station. I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life professionally. And so, having been turned down at Muskegon and didn't have much money, Joe Maddie offered me a job as an assistant in the radio department at the National Music Camp up in Interlochen, Michigan, which was run by the fellow who was the radio department was run by a fellow by the name of Jerry Wiesner, who was really a scientist, but he was running the radio department up there. Jerry went on to become Jack Kennedy's science advisor and the president of MIT, but he was my boss there. And I spent a month there, during the course of which time I got the opportunity to go down to Grand Rapids to audition, and I got the job at $20 a week as a radio announcer on staff at WOOD in Grand Rapids. Its call letters that because it was owned by a furniture store. A radio announcer did everything. A radio announcer did play-by-play sports, and he announced the news, and he announced commercials, and he conceivably did interviews. I didn't know. I wanted to learn about radio and see what turned out. And it turned out to be a wonderful way to begin because it was an apprenticeship, a paid apprenticeship. And those were the days when a steak dinner cost you $1.25. So that $20 a week, that was big dough. And after about almost a year, this WOOD was on the Michigan Radio Network, and the center, the flagship station was at WXYZ in Detroit. And I auditioned for a job down there and got it. And WXYZ in Detroit was owned by the King Trendle Broadcasting Corporation, an ABC station. And I became, when I got there at $50 a week, I was one of the Cunningham news aces. Cunningham drugstores were the sponsors of the Douglas Edwards and I were the two Cunningham news aces at WXYZ at the time. In addition to which, I was the announcer and narrator for the Green Hornet and Ned Jordan's Secret Agent and the Challenge of the Yukon. And occasionally, they let me fill in for the announcer on the Lone Ranger, which was big time. So but what it did was I began to learn my craft and learn the business. And then in September of 1941, I was asked if I wanted to come to Chicago to audition as an announcer for Road of Life, the story of Dr. Jim Brent, which was a soap opera, at the time, written by the queen of the soap operas, Erna Phillips. Went to Chicago, got the job, left Detroit, and by this time I was in the center of the radio business. Actually, Chicago back then was full of soap operas and full of kid shows like Sky King and Jack Armstrong and Captain Midnight. It was an exciting place to be, and so I had nothing to do with news whatsoever. I was quite happy just doing Road of Life and other jobs. And then at that time in Chicago, Marshall Field started something called the Chicago Sun. This was a big fight in Chicago. The Chicago Tribune was the isolationist newspaper and the voice of the America's heartland, so to speak. And there were Marshall Field, who owned the department store that bore his name, decided that it was time for Chicago to have a more liberal newspaper in competition. And so when he started that, he also started a radio station, or he bought a radio station maybe that was already in existence called WJWC. And Clifton Utley, who was the most prominent news name in Chicago, in the Middle West at that time. He was the father of Garrick Utley, the newsman, now at CNN, formerly at NBC. Clifton was going to start the air edition of the Chicago Sun, and I was fascinated about the possibility of going to work over there, so I wrote to him and auditioned for him, and we had a meeting together, and he offered me $55 a week to do a 5-minute newscast on the radio every hour on the half hour during the day and one 15-minute local news at night. And then by that time you were writing as well as delivering the news. Still not covering, not reporting, but you were simply rewriting, and all of the stuff that I had done in news up to that time. But I didn't work the streets, I just ripped and read or took the wire service stuff and rewrote it.